Washington, D.C. I think that we have known each other for going on about 15 years or so, maybe longer.
More.
Yeah, okay. Time flies when you're having fun, as we say. We first met at the World Bank, where Dr. Burnett was the head of human development activities in West and Central Africa. We have a network of friends that has continued on over time. After working at the World Bank for how many years was it?
20.
20 years. I think almost directly moved over to education, to the Global Monitoring Report, which many of you are aware of, at UNESCO in Paris, and from there became Assistant Director General for Education of UNESCO for 10 years?
Oh, no. 2.5.
2.5?
Yes.
Did it seem like 10 to you?
Obviously, I had a big influence, yeah.
Well, you did.
Oh, right.
You did. Gosh.
No.
It felt like longer. Well, you learn these things when you're trying to introduce somebody who have it completely wrong. Well, I had the location right, and I had the job right. I just didn't have the number of years right. And since that time has been working, I guess, pretty much since the UNESCO job, working to build up this organization called Results for Development. But I think more important than the particular functions that Nick Burnett has had is his commitment to the kinds of issues that many of us care about here, which are dealing with a broad array of human development concerns as seen in the context of poor developing countries and trying to make a difference using the data that either exists or that can be made to exist. And of course that was a key function of the Global Monitoring Report. And we were just talking earlier, I hadn't known what studies Nick Burnett had earlier on, and I have now discovered they were largely in economics, which is not entirely surprising. But he also mentioned that his father was an academic also, and I think that's always interesting in a different field, in the field of botany. But I think that this, I mentioned this because much of the kind of work that we talk about here in the program at the Graduate School of Education is how can we collect information, how can we use information, how can we create innovation in education using the best available information that we can find. And that happens to be the topic of his talk today, which is fostering innovation in education. Let us welcome Nick Burnett.
Thank you.
So the rules of our series are that the speaker speaks for about 40-45 minutes. If you have a technical question, you're free to ask it, but then we'll have open discussion after that for about 30-40 minutes, depending on how we do it. And then he will be running off to catch a train, and we will be running off to do other things. So that is what, and I will keep the time. Nick,
Thank you.
up to you.
It's up to you. Yeah, maybe, can you get these ones? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, Dan or Professor Wagner. It's a great pleasure to be here. I can tell I'm in a developed country because I have two tests for whether I'm in a developing country or a developed country, which don't have to do with per capita income. One has got to do with when public spending on health exceeds that on education, you know you're in a developed country. And the other is when women exceed men in the teaching force, you know you're in a developed country. Right. So today what I want to do is to talk about innovation, which of course is a very popular word. And I want to talk about it in education. And I want to, Dan mentioned that I'm at Results for Development. So I'm actually going to try to illustrate what I want to talk about from work that we are actually currently conducting. So I hope that this may give you an opportunity to not only to learn about some areas and to discuss some areas, but also to get some sense of what people at our institute might be doing, because many of them are people with profiles quite similar to those you have or you will have. So first of all, just what is this institute? As was mentioned, it's a non-profit. It's grown from nothing 7 years ago to now over 60 people. We're working in 4 areas, which you can see marked on the right there. More work is going on in health than in education, but I'm leading the work on education. But we're also doing some work in market dynamics, which has applicability to both health and education, natural shaping of markets for things like bed nets or books or textbooks. And then we're doing some work in governance, not around sort of democracy and things like that, but around social accountability, which also links back into education. And we as an institute have quite deliberately chosen to work on a small number of difficult problems that we hope could make a difference. So we're not competing with the big Washington consulting firms and so on, FHI 360s and these type of places. We're in a kind of niche thing, which is probably why we've been reasonably successful. And we're also deliberately using multidisciplinary approaches. So our work in education is around several areas, and I'm going to touch on all of these in the context of talking about innovation. So we're working around actually finding out about innovations around the world. We're working around skills, secondary education in particular, a very neglected area. We're working around broader aspects of analysis and learning, and we're working around innovative financing. So I'm going to touch on some, but not all of these today. So what I'll do, as I said already, I'll discuss innovation and illustrate it from our work, which would hopefully give you some sense of what work consists of at our place. And I'll discuss it really under 5 headings. So first of all, a couple of questions of a general nature. Why does education need innovation? Perhaps it doesn't need innovation. Maybe education should continue to be like this, somebody lecturing at a group of passive students. Maybe it should continue like that, or maybe it should change. What do we mean by innovation? And then I'll illustrate from these 3 of our areas of work. This Center for Education Innovations, we've set up some of our work around secondary education and some work around innovative financing. So we may be working in a small number of areas, but we've tried to pick these ones which have some potential importance to change things. So first of all, why do we need innovation? Well, I think there are obvious reasons and not so obvious reasons. So the most obvious reason, especially in a course in a school or in a program devoted to looking at international education issues, is that while we can celebrate a lot of success on the international goals, we're certainly not there. And of course, we have all seen various ways of demonstrating that. So just probably to show you a few things you already know, massive increase in secondary education in the last decade, whereas primary continuing to increase. In fact, most children in the world now going to secondary, getting some secondary. Nonetheless, persisting problem of out-of-school children. This graph actually draws on a different piece of work we've done. You've all studied, I'm sure, the arguments for education, right? Rights and capabilities and growth and development and all those things. So we actually try to flip that and say, well, what are the economic costs of not educating children? So we've done some work which is available on our website around the proportion of GDP that has been lost as a result of not educating. And you can see that this can be quite high in some countries, like 8% in Senegal, for example. And we deliberately have done this work in a conservative way so that nobody can attack our data. So if in doubt, we take a low estimate, not a high estimate. It's order of magnitude stuff. We wouldn't ourselves claim it's precise, but it's kind of interesting, I think, to just to flip the argument and see what the consequences of not doing something are rather than the advantages of doing something. Okay, I mean, of course, everyone working in international education is now alert to and beginning to try to do something about the so-called learning crisis. Despite the fact there are still children not in school, most are in school, and the problem is that many in school are not actually learning much, or in some cases anything. So this is actually from that global monitoring report, the most recent one, and I think it shows you that 250 million children who've reached grade 4, 250 million, that's a huge number. I mean, are not actually able to read at that level. I mean, it's just a simple but extraordinary stark fact. Okay? I already touched on the growth of secondary, but I think another key issue, and these are sort of reasons why we need to think about innovation. Let me remind you, that's why I'm talking about it. You know, the whole question of youth employment, unemployment, you've probably seen all these estimates, and you know, they may be right, they may be wrong, but again, I think the order of magnitude is right. You know, large numbers of new workers entering the global workforce, mismatch between needs for skilled workers and excess supply of unskilled ones. Increasing evidence that, you know, again, I'm sure you've studied all of this, that I mean, it used to be argued that it was the number of years in school that affected productivity and earnings. Now, increasing evidence that that may have effect still. It does have an effect still, because children who've had some education but still can't read still earn more than those who, when they become adult, than those who haven't had an education and can't read. So that's interesting. But still, the increasing evidence that actually the skills you acquire are important, and especially these so-called 21st century skills, you know, soft skills, whatever word you want to use. And again, returns to secondary education now much higher than those to primary. And yet, secondary education designed not as what it actually is, which is the exit level from formal education, a formal school education for most people, but it designed as a route to higher education for the minority who are actually going to that. So I mean, here's an argument for innovation. Okay, and then also from the Global Monitoring Report, you know, since another estimate of as it were, of why we need innovation, you know, 10%. Their estimate is 10% of spending on education is lost simply because of these systems that are not, in fact, educating people. And that's just at the primary level. That is a huge, huge number. And another reason, which may get me into some trouble, education is not very cost effective in some parts of the world. So what does a teacher get paid in the United States as a factor of per capita income? About 1. The average teacher salary is somewhere around a per capita income. Same thing in Latin America. And what is it in Africa? Depending on the level, it varies from 4 to 7 times per capita income. So how is this sustainable? So I'm not arguing that you should go out and fire teachers or reduce their salaries and so on, but there are some intrinsic cost issues around education in its present form in developing countries that probably need innovation to help deal with. Okay, so here we've touched on several reasons for innovation in terms of the current state of the, let me just go back to that overview slide, current state of education. We've touched on these failures, despite many successes, failures to achieve the international goals. We've touched on the youth unemployment issue. We've touched on the inappropriateness of secondary education. We've touched on the costs being too high. And then there's something else, which is more of a sort of gut sort of thing. But if you look around at different sectors, whether it's, you know, industry or software or health or transport, you see innovation happening all the time. When you look at education, well, you're in an educational institution. Do you see that happening all the time? Exactly. I see people not nodding their heads, sorry, shaking their heads. So there's something intrinsically conservative about this sector. Not necessarily politically conservative. Often teachers are quite radical and so on, but something intrinsically conservative, which I increasingly think, and that's just a personal view based on years of sort of observing it, is a serious problem. And it's got to do, I think, with the fact that the people who run systems themselves come from the system. So educational administrator in Africa typically began actually as a teacher, didn't begin as an administrator, and so on. And so you kind of rise through the ranks, and it's not absolutely not any individual's fault, but the collective effect of it is that what you think that the way to do things is the way that you currently do things. So I think that is just something to put out there about the kind of sociology, if you like, of who manages education systems. And it's also an important factor in when you want to start to think about how might you diffuse educations. You're going to have to deal with this inherent conservatism of the profession, and especially of those in positions who are able to take decisions about the future. So let me go back to where we were. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. I just get there quickly. Right, so we touched on all of these things. Oh, one I'd missed, sorry, which is also important. So it has been until recently the case that aid for education was constantly increasing. It was never at the levels that people like me, when I was at the Global Monitoring Report, wanted it to be at, but it was constantly increasing. And now it's started to decline. And what's worse, although we don't have very good data yet, it appears to be declining faster than aid as a whole. So not only, I mean, all aid is declining because of, the last five years or so of economic slowdown in industrial countries. But the worrying thing is that the share of education appears to be declining within that already declining pot. So there's another reason we probably need innovation. We can't continue to rely, and why we certainly need innovation in finance, because we can't continue to rely, even as much as we inadequately did in the past, on aid to plug some of the financing gaps. Right, so that's the kind of background why I think that innovation matters for education. But I've been using this word as if we all know what it means. And probably we all think we know what it means. And it's actually, that's probably correct. So I want to stress that we are kind of using it, not in any very precise way, quite deliberately. But basically we're thinking about it in terms of like any change in policy or practice at any part of the system that improves access or improves quality or reduces costs. We've seen those costs being high, but from the point of view of the poor. Now that's obviously not a definition of innovation, the point about for the poor, but that's the angle which I and the programs I'm working in are interested in. Obviously there's other innovation which is important for the education of the elites and so on, but that's not the angle we're interested in. Second point, which is very important, and I had the pleasure of having lunch with a few of you, and this topic came up. Somebody said, well, I can't remember exactly what she said, but said something about, well, education, innovation being about technology, and absolutely not is my response. Some innovation is about technology, but the essence of innovation is changing things in ways that make a difference, and this may or may not involve technology. And I give you a very specific example then of something which, again, this will be boring for the few who had lunch, but for the others I hope interesting. Something which is not at all about technology, but which appears to be beginning to make a big difference. So there's this group of young, maybe somebody knows about, anybody heard about STIR? S-T-I-R? No, okay. So there's this group of young Indians, anybody from India? Yeah, okay. There's this group of young Indians, well, you should have heard about it. Perhaps you've been out a long time. There's this group of young Indians who, weren't from education, but were very upset about what was going on in education, or not going on in education. So they kind of thought about things and looked around a bit, and they, of course, discovered, which we all know, I think, that although there may be systems that are bad, there are always within those systems pockets which are not bad, pockets of excellence or pockets of competence. Similarly, even if the average, and specifically what they discovered was that even if the average performance of teachers is not too good, there are always good teachers. So they set about this very simple idea. How can we learn from the practices of these good classroom practices of these good teachers in India and get that transferred, to the not so good teachers? Simple as that. And they set up a whole system to do that, and awarding kind of, which both recognizes the good teachers so they feel good about it, but also then as part of the recognition put some obligations on them to, in fact, deliberately they have to then work with, I forget how many, some quite small number initially, 5 other teachers or something to help them and so on. So it's a kind of structured peer system, if you want. And it's very, very simple. It's got nothing to do with technology, or a little bit to do with technology. Technology is very slightly involved in order to help disseminate some of these practices, but in general it's got nothing much to do with technology. And it appears to be working really quite well. And I just gone on about it because A, you hadn't heard about it, and B, because it's an important example, I think, of a completely non-technological innovation. Now, people who, excuse me, people who have, there are of course theorists of innovation, as there are theorists of everything, and they talk in terms of mainly 2 types of, do we have any innovation experts in the room? Nobody is willing to admit to being one. Okay. They talk about 2 types of innovation, so-called disruptive innovation and so-called supportive innovation. So disruptive innovation is that which really, as the name implies, really changes complete system in some way. And supportive innovation is one which doesn't really challenge the basis of the system, but makes it work better. Many people who have looked at this question, think that what we should be striving for in education is disruptive innovation. I don't think we know the answer to that. Personally, I'm not convinced. Because I think that many small changes, as this example I just gave of STIR, which don't necessarily challenge the system head on, but which do lead over time to quite big changes. For me, I think that the way to ultimately disrupt the system is through a series of supportive innovations. At some point, they will accumulate such that the system will change. But other people think that what's needed is to change it as it were, one fell swoop. This is an interesting thing. I don't think there's any empirical evidence on it, certainly not in education. I'm not aware of any. And there's not much empirical evidence on it in other fields, though there's some. But I just mentioned it because if you discuss innovation more with other people, this topic might come up. The next point I want to make is that despite the fact that I've said that we need innovation, you might think there wasn't a lot of innovation, but actually there is a huge amount of innovation. The problem is, it's pretty small scale, and it's not expanding, it's not being copied by others, and this sort of thing. And so most people don't know about it. And a second problem is that even when we do know about it, we don't actually know if it works or not. A lot of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it. We have many things which certainly are innovative and look as if they might work, but actually we don't really know that. And then there's a further set of questions, which is, well, if they do indeed work, how might you scale them? So I want to touch on some of the interesting aspects of this, and who's getting involved in this area, because I think it is emerging as an area. The first thing is, which is, please do not misinterpret me, not an anti-public school system remark, but the first thing is that most innovation that is occurring is not coming from the public system. I won't say all, but most. Most is coming from the non-state part of education. So I use that term quite deliberately rather than private, because I want to encompass quite clearly non-profits, for-profits, basically everything which is not the state. And most of the innovation is occurring now. And it's somewhat interesting, I think, that this is the part of education that in much of the developing world is currently growing faster than the public system. Again, I'm not taking any position on that, I'm just noting it. So back to India, 80% of urban Indian children now going to private schools. 80. Kibera slum in Nairobi, 83% of all 4-year-olds now going to a private preschool. So, interesting, huh? There are similar things for other slums in Africa, there are similar things for Ghana and so on. Pakistan, etc. So it's a very dynamic area, and part of the reason why are parents opting to send their children to these private schools, which all the evidence indicates it may not necessarily be better, but because they are certainly they certainly are innovative. And there are other reasons too, of course. Like in India, they teach in English, and that's what parents perceive that it's a good thing and so on. So I mean, that's a whole other subject, the growth of private education. I just want to point out that this is where a lot of the innovation is occurring. Second thing is that we've seen used to be that the international financing players in education were basically aid agencies. And we've seen in the this century essentially, the entry of foundations more into this area. I'm not saying they weren't in it before, but they weren't heavily in it. So you see, so you find many American foundations, for instance, that were previously active in domestic US education, now getting interested also in third world education. And foundations are, of course, much more able to foster innovation than are governments with the taxpayer funds, or even aid agencies also with taxpayer funds. So I think we've seen an increased willingness to take some risk as a very positive advantage of the entry of these foundations. This question of scale is very interesting. It's another word which is used all the time, like innovation, but actually what does it mean? And we thought we'd scale it up, like as if we all know what that means, right? But obviously scaling up something from 1 school to 10 is completely different than scaling it up from 10 schools to a school district or a country. So in fact, and it's also completely different from taking an innovation in one place, one geography, and replicating it or replicating some elements of it in another geography. So actually we need to think a lot, and that won't be a lot of our subject today, but it's something to think about, actually how does one go about scaling things up, especially in that environment I mentioned of a somewhat conservative sector. And part of the answer clearly has to do with things that are part of the current sort of good shifts in the way education is being thought about, like much more use of evidence and this sort of thing. But part of it may have to do with other things, to do with the political economy. And there's an interesting question that since, unlike health, since education is still dominated and will, as far as I can see, be despite the expansion of the non-state sector, will still be dominated by the public system. I mean, globally, still something like 80% of education is public. At least at primary, secondary level. You know, would we consider effective scale up to be when something actually is adopted by the public system? Would that be so these are some sort of questions. I'm just sort of throwing out ways of thinking about these things. Now, let me. But one final thing. So this comes not from. This is not particular to education, but it puts together some of those points I just mentioned. A bit how innovations are developed and then scaled. So it's pretty obvious stuff, except sometimes the obvious is what we haven't thought about. You know, so first of all, the idea you develop the idea, then you test it and develop it further, which may include some expansion. Then you work out what are the conditions. This is more of an industrial example, but it would still apply. What are the conditions for scaling it in a much bigger way, and you work to enhance those conditions. And then finally you do roll the thing out to a larger number of, well, not customers in this case, but a larger number of students, let's say. And that is essentially the stages of scaling. And in our work, as I'm about to describe, we're actually interested in the last three of these. We're not so interested in the first, because we're not very original thinkers, but we can work on these other problems. Right. So I want to now talk about how we work on these type of things. So we kind of come up with a sort of very simple approach, which involves really three types of activity. So aggregating, analyzing, and convening, or collaborating. And one could use different words. It doesn't really matter. And these are all pretty straightforward to describe, not quite so straightforward to do. So the aggregating is, well, as I mentioned, there are a lot of innovations, it turns out there. The problem is nobody knows about them, except everybody knows, of course, about a few. So everybody here has heard of Escuela Nueva, right? Well, it's not so new. Most people here have heard Bridge International Academy, right? Not everybody, interesting. But you know, who here has heard of Educate ! Very interesting program in Uganda. Okay, somebody. But you know, there are other. Nobody had heard of STIR. So I mean, there are you know, and these are actually all relatively well-known ones. But there are many others that aren't. So there's a question of just getting the information, and then how do we capture and put what is relevant information from them? Then there's the analytical part, which has to do with, well, okay, so now we've found these innovations. On the surface, at least, let's say we found the ones that look as if they work. We don't actually know if they work. So what can we do about that? How can we determine what is the, whether they work or not? What's their impact? What's their cost effectiveness? And also, what is the intrinsic part of it? Because especially if you want to be thinking about replication, you've got this important question, well, what is context specific and what is not? What is the bit you could pick up and move over here and do it? And what's the bit that can only work in, you know, because we're in Philadelphia or whatever? And then the last part has to do with how you're getting information about this out, and in particular how to help innovators work with each other, and how to connect them with people they might need to be connected with, like policymakers or policy implementers. Well, just government, let's say, or with sources of finance, for example. So this is a kind of very simple sort of approach that we have tried to adopt in several aspects of our work. The first of which is something we have established called Center for Education Innovation. I think this was in the flyer, so perhaps one or two of you have had a look at it. So this is something which has is trying to ultimately foster, you know, to use this word I don't really like very much, but it's a kind of in-word, the ecosystem for innovation in education, i.e. the environment for it, by documenting what's going on. And so far we have some 400 innovations from around the developing world listed, and that will expand quite rapidly. By starting to and that's mainly what we've been doing so far. This has only existed for a year. They're categorized under these different categories. These are inherently arbitrary and could be changed, but one has to have some sort of taxonomy. So we've organized them under delivery, you know, actual classroom staff, financing, policy analysis, support for schools and support for students. But one could organize things the other way. There's nothing very special about that. It's just you have to organize somehow. And what are we actually doing then? Well, we're trying to provide comprehensive, up-to-date information about these innovations. So that's a web thing. That's a web thing. It's there for anybody who wants to have access to it. And as I said, we have over 400 now. And that's what we did largely for the first year. Now we're continuing to expand that, but now we're moving into these two much more interesting areas of analyzing and of convening and connecting. So analyzing is really a crucial question. So it is stunning how many promising innovations don't even themselves collect proper results data, much less have had any type of monitoring system or any type of evaluation, much less any type of external evaluation. So it is really becoming evident that there's a big problem here, that we have all these innovations, but we literally don't know how most of them work. And I'll come in a minute to how we might think a bit more about some of that. Then we have the question of connecting. So connecting stakeholders to the different, to other parties, as I already indicated, particularly with regard to such things as scale up. So here what we've been doing is we've established 5, we haven't established, so we are working with 5 local partners in India, Pakistan, South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya/Uganda. And the idea is that these local partners will be doing a lot of this because you need to be on the ground to do this sort of thing. So this gives you some sense of where these programs are so far. We have no geographic preference or anything. This is just where the information has come so far. But obviously where we have those local partners, you can see that those countries like South Africa and India and so on are where you have more programs than others, which isn't surprising because they help to source them. It doesn't mean there aren't more programs in all the other places, it just means we haven't yet got them documented. You can sort this database, by topic area, so we can see a lot of them are about teacher training, and most are about teacher training. Only 5%, 22 are about low-cost private schools, and so on. But I mean, you don't need to absorb the detail of that, but just to show the sort of thing you can do. You can, here is technology, here's some different types of program, there's some 70 technology programs, and so on. Now we're doing something very interesting. We just started this last week, so I think this may be of great interest to you. It's certainly of great interest to us. So UNICEF came to us on having seen what we were doing. And they said, oh, well, we've actually got 800 innovations that we're supporting, 800. And we don't have a clue which ones are effective and which ones aren't. Can you help? And we said, well, we're facing that sort of a problem ourselves, so we'd like to try to help, but we don't want to pretend to you that we have the answer. So actually now we're going into a joint program with them, which is very interesting, where they're both giving us some support and putting in some of their own people to basically work around 2 questions. One, when you have reasonably good information about an innovation, but you don't actually know if it works or not, are there things you can look at which will help you predict whether it's likely to be working or not? So that's the first question. Answer, we don't yet know, but probably there are, derived both from theory and also from what we do know about which innovations actually do and don't work. So that, and kind of this is a very interesting sort of question of developing methodology where you identify key characteristics, etc. And then the second question has to do is how might you evaluate these ones rapidly? Because, I'm sure you've been exposed more than you wanted to randomized control trials and things like that. Okay, so if we haven't got 5 years and $5 million, but we've got something that looks interesting, what might we do about it, which is beyond description and which is well short of RCT? So methods of assessing effectiveness. So this is kind of the work we're now embarked upon them. with UNICEF, and they sort of provided a carrot to help the programs, some of theirs and some of the ones we've documented, collaborate with this work, which is that at the end, 5 or 6 of some 80 which will be used for this study will be given, funds that they can use to expand. So there's a kind of incentive there, and maybe that scaling, that expanding at the end, may be an interesting thing too. That's down the road. We'll see. So here is, I just want to describe this because this, I think, is one of the central questions around education innovation, and actually nobody really knows how to answer these questions. And I hope we're going to find some of those answers. I don't think it'll be something very profound. Actually, I think it'll be a whole lot of mechanical things. But it will be very interesting to see if this works or not. How are we doing on time?
About 10 more.
10 more, right. So I was going to talk a bit about skills. I've talked rather briefly on that because I wanted to make the same points about aggregating, analyzing, and convening around work we've done at secondary education. So we've done this work in these various regions you can see here. I'm going to go faster here because I've already explained a lot of this. Again, the idea of bringing together what is known, both from theory, both from interviewing, and from identifying programs that seem to be working, and then of connecting people together. So we did this pretty successfully, but in a rather restricted geography. We only were able to take it fully far in India and in Kenya because simply of it's funding. But it's proven a fairly interesting way to look at these same type of similar types of problems, similar types of innovations, but specifically in this case at secondary level. This is sort of stuff I think you're all very familiar with about the different types of skills, so we won't spend our time going into it. Although there's one thing I do want to mention that is perhaps not widely known. That although this type of work around skills for employment is typically focused on employment in the formal economy. Yet most jobs in the developing world, at least for the next 20 years or so, are going to be in the informal economy. So we need to think more, we argue, about what's needed for the informal economy. And what work we have so far done indicates very interestingly that these, it's a horrible word, these so-called non-cognitive or 21st century, we haven't got a good term, but anyway, those skills are even more important in the informal economy than in the formal one. Why? Because essentially people in the informal economy have to multitask. They can't just operate a lathe or install plumbing equipment or something. They actually have to do many different things in the day. And so this ability to work in teams, to turn up on time, all these things become actually much more important. We analyzed some of the key elements. This is part of my point about looking at what things are crucial to making things work. I won't go into that in more depth because I want to get to financing. Right, so first of all, I don't know, is financing part of what you study here? I suppose it is. Well, probably largely it's around, I assume, around public financing of education, government spending, aid, etc. So what we've become interested in is so-called innovative financing and also alternative financing, i.e. types of financing of education which are not actually those two, which are not actually government spending and which are not provided by aid donors. And so the kind of innovative finance began very much, original ideas, not for education, just more generally, came out of France and French concern about the negative effects of globalization and thinking that somehow those who benefit from the positive effects of globalization, such as people who are reasonably affluent and can buy air tickets and travel around the world, should somehow have to support those who don't do so well out of it. So the idea that somehow it was linked, therefore, that somehow this should be linked to helping those who don't do so well, so somehow linked to global public goods. This thinking was mainly around health and complementary, traditional, and additional to aid, and also more stable and predictable than aid. So we can't, in our work we've gone along with that, but we said, well, that seems a bit narrow actually. Why should it just be about international funding? And we've also said, perhaps we ought to pay attention to how this money is spent, not just how it is raised. So the classic case of innovative financing is in health is the airline tax that most European countries charge, which you probably don't know you're paying when you go on a European airline, but it's probably something like €1 per ticket, which is in there as a tax which actually goes to ultimately through a series of mechanisms ends up funding, in part funding the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and malaria. So there's a tax, that's the point, tax on, in that case it's a tax. But on those who are kind of benefiting from globalization to try to help those who are not benefiting from it. So that was the kind of thinking of it. And how might we think about this in terms of education? Well, I think we might think about it in terms of 3 areas. Broad taxes, corporate social responsibility, which wouldn't exactly fit that innovative term, but it's important, certainly fit alternative. And finally, what I'm very unimaginatively called other ideas, though many of them are actually quite interesting. So on broad taxes, another tax which has recently been enacted in many European countries, but which the US, of course, is vehemently opposing, is this financial transaction tax, which is a tax on, as it sounds like, tax on financial transactions. With the idea, and of course it's in part been able to be got through because of the anti-banker mood of the world. But the idea is that the tax though still hasn't actually been put in place. It will start being collected, I think, this year or next year in about 13 countries. And the idea is that some of those proceeds will go to regulate the financial sector and so on, but quite a lot of it will also go for development. Not necessarily for education, but education could get some share of it. Though increasingly the development, there's a worry that the development part may be getting a bit lost in the anti-banker mood thing may be going a bit too far, and the idea of that also benefiting the poor somewhere else may be getting a bit lost. The second type, which is very interesting for education, so the question there, if that happens, is how does education get its share? It's not a special education question, how does education get its share? Similarly, as we see now, and you see in the GMR last year, for example, Global Monitoring Report, a lot of discussion about using extractive industry taxes, oil or things like that, to pay for education. But again, really the question isn't that, it's how to get education's share of these things, which could obviously be used for anything. So that's a question. And then very interesting are specific taxes for education. So India, 2 years ago, passed a special tax to so-called cess to finance the improvement of education. Many countries have so-called training levies to finance vocational training. Philippines has a special tax for early childhood. Thailand is enacting a tax to try to get a special tax to finance. Even in Thailand, there's many children still not in school, to getting the last whatever percent it is into school. So taxes is one area. It's not the most innovative area, obviously, but it's a kind of interesting area. The second area has to do with corporate social responsibility. So I don't have time to go into that in any depth, but I think we all know what that is. What is interesting is that in at least 2 countries now, major countries, this is now becoming not a voluntary activity, but a mandatory activity. So in both India and South Africa, corporations must have corporate social responsibility programs. And interestingly, education appears to, and of course they can spend it on what they want, they're not being told what to spend it on. But what is turning out to be interesting is that in both those places, education appears to be high on the agenda of what these corporations are interested in. So that's an interesting area, whether that needs a lot more work to find out about. And then finally there's what I call other, which is a whole series of different things. But basically I'll just mention a few of them. The ones in red are the ones I think have the most promise for education, at least short term. So, some of which have already been done. So debt for education swaps. Country, Spain essentially forgave debt that Argentina owed it, so long as Argentina spent the same amount of money, not in foreign exchange, but in Argentine pesos, on education. Same thing, Germany, Indonesia. second thing, which some work we were actually involved in, as aid declines, it may be that we have to think more about loans for education, international loans. You may not like that, but it may be that was what we have to do. So maybe we have to think about getting those loans onto more concessional terms. So how could we use some funding, which may be concessional, to buy down, reduce the terms, make softer the lending terms of institutions that are lending at rates that are a bit high for the borrowers. So very interesting pilot is about to be tried, based, I'm proud to say, on some work we did, though we're not involved in the pilot, whereby the Global Program for Education will try to use a small amount of its money to reduce the terms on loans by the Islamic Development Bank, which makes loans to education for in actually about 40 countries which have Muslim majorities, and including, of course, many of those West African countries where the education program problems are among the most severe in the world. But this Islamic bank, of course, being an Islamic bank, doesn't charge interest, but it has equivalent. It has a whole series of charges which actually are, you could say, they won't say, but are equivalent to interest, and they actually add up to quite high interest. So Islamic Development Bank loans in the current global environment in which you can get mortgage, I still have a house in France from when I was there. I have a mortgage on that of 1.2%. And you can get, so that's kind of what the global interest rates are like. And the Islamic Bank is charging something around 4 or 5% in that sort of environment. That is very high for these countries to borrow. In fact, many of them are not capable. So can we somehow get these, by combining funds from these different sources, still get much more money in, especially today? Of course, it's going to have to be paid off in the future. But get it in today because the need is today. Other things we probably don't have time for, public-private partnerships, etc. That's probably enough to give you a flavor of it. I'm not trying to be comprehensive. This is not a lecture about innovative financing, though I'd be happy to do one on another occasion. This is something we're very interested in. So I think I would stop there. One final point. You are perhaps slightly familiar with the idea of impact investing. People who want to, private individuals who want to invest their money both to get some financial return and to get some social return, achieve some social purpose. So what is very interesting when you look at the sources of finance, at least the international sources of finance, is you have quite a lot, lots of institutions, foundations and so on, that are making grants, pure grants. So they're interested not in the financial return. And you actually have quite a lot that are interested actually only in the financial return, such as the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank and others. And you have almost nobody in this interesting middle area, which is another contrast with health, where you have lots of people who are interested in a modest financial return and a social impact. So that's an area I think that we think may be worth exploring. And well, definitely it's worth exploring, and we're trying to do something in that area. So that's, I think that is where I will stop. Thank you very much. I've been possibly too high level, I don't know, but I've tried to discuss various aspects of innovation, including innovative finance. Thank you.
Thanks. So, I have a whole page of questions that I'm going to resist, and the floor is open. We have time for about 30 minutes or so of questions and comments. So you simply need to raise your hand and Dr. Burnett will call on you. It certainly touches on many of the areas that we do talk about, what you were bringing to our attention today. Or if people need me to get going, I'll ask one person at a time.
No, we have one.
Question?
Yes. So I'm still a little curious why it's really your so if you maybe wanted to touch on that in terms of how it, I guess it's incorporated within the research you do, or how,
Right.
your institute.
Fine. So you're quite right to point that out as a question implying criticism. That's fair enough. I'd say our work is focused on, I said poor as a shorthand, so it's focused on poor and disadvantaged, so that will and so then we come to what are the reasons for poverty and disadvantage, and gender is obviously one, as is, well, you mean you know this stuff, as are disabilities, as are, as are various other things. So I mean, I just didn't mention it, but in fact we are very focused on it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming today. I had a question. I was really interested in this idea of, when you're looking to scale up an innovation, and you're looking at its, what's its real feasibility, but you don't have 5 years
Right.
with the capacity for an RCT. How do you do that kind of quick and dirty? And in that framework, what I'm curious of is how you control for confounding variables, in the sense that maybe that innovation is effective because of its exceptionalism. And they introduce this innovation through teachers that are already really invested, and then parents who are invested send their kids to this school with this innovation, and that's why it works, and it's not sustainable for the whole system. So how do you look at those types of things when you're running?
Right. So I mean, I don't have the answer, but what I tried to describe was that the work we are now embarking on with UNICEF, we hope to be able to look at some of those questions. So I mean, we've got some ideas about it, but we don't really have a systematic way of doing it. And part of those ideas, to elaborate slightly on what I said in the talk, derive from some new methods of evaluation that seem to be being developed. It has some title which I've managed to forget, but anyway, we can find it out later, which is basically around trying to describe an innovation in terms of a whole series of characteristics in terms of yes, no, or 0, 1 or something, in a binary form. Either it has this characteristic or it doesn't. So try to get the description down to those sort of things. And then to take evidence from the things which have been subject to RCTs or similar serious things, and see and reinterpret that evidence against this classification, this simplified classification system, which may still end up with, 100 or 150 characteristics. It may, and then try and see, well, are there something common elements for programs in the same sort of area, obviously, on those characteristics, and work done in other sectors indicates there are. Now, it doesn't mean that's true in education. We can't make that assumption, but it's a reasonable assumption it might be so. So that's what we want to try to do. So we would hopefully, therefore, develop a way of categorizing innovations in great detail, for innovations in a particular sub-area. And we'll have to think about what those sub-areas are. But probably we're going to start with 2 areas because we have a lot of data, actually, or potentially, we or UNICEF have a lot of data about these 2 areas. One is teacher training, and another is early learning programs. Not full early childhood, but early learning, sort of preschool, essentially. Well, that's especially an interest of theirs. So we'll see, I think. But I mean, if you're very interested in this, I don't have it in my head, but I can send you some reference to work in other sectors.
Yeah, I want you to introduce yourself when you ask questions.
Oh, yes.
I'm Kara Dorian. Thank you so much for coming. It's really interesting. And I actually just wanted to ask this question because I know a lot of people in this room are really interested in teacher training and development. And
Yeah.
that was obviously one of the most emphasized by your organization. And I was wondering, what innovations have you seen across the contexts that have been helpful for teacher training?
Right. So I can answer that question in about 2 months because we've got somebody working on those 120 programs to try to that we've documented to try to look at that question. So I don't have a very good answer at this point, but I mean we have some parts of the answer which I can remember. And those I think are not necessarily surprises to you, but it's interesting to have them confirmed. That, I mean, the one which, I mean, won't really surprised at all, but yet it's surprising how little it is done. The more that actual classroom practice is part of the training, the more effective the training is. Secondly, apparently, the shorter the pre-service training, the more effective it is. There must be some level below which that's not true. But I mean, still, it's interesting. I mean, you don't. It seems that you don't really need these 2 or 3 year teacher training programs. Maybe that's wrong. It's probably dangerous school of education to talk about that. But also, if we look, I mean, so that's one sort of set of things where evidence has been collected. Then there's some other interesting things which I think can only describe as interesting at this point. So part of the secret of these low-cost private schools, I don't know, some of you have perhaps looked at some of these, is that, you know, they're not hiring trained teachers. They are hiring people who have some education, typically have completed secondary school. So they're certainly hiring people who have successfully completed. I mean, they're hiring people who are definitely illiterate and definitely know something. But interestingly, they are scripting everything. So it's a kind of modern version of what used to be the joke about the French education system, that you could, you know, at 11 o'clock you could say you knew exactly what every teacher in France was doing. So anyone in some of these schools, in the lesson on whatever it is, lesson 13 on, you know, elementary reading, you know, every teacher who's teaching that lesson is doing exactly the same thing. And then that links to another thing which is very interesting. So all of this stuff is just suggestive and very upsetting to the teaching profession. That some of these places are actually hiring teachers. I mean, of course, with that basic literacy also, but one of the characteristics they're looking for the most is the ability to act. Act. In order to convey things to students rather than, you know, just to lecture at them or mark things or something. So this is all very interesting, I think. So I mean, and quite interesting, especially in the context of very poor children, what might animate them and this sort of things. But I think I want to stress, I don't think this is evidence. This is stuff which is sort of interesting and suggestive. It would be good to have we're not going to do that, have some people look at that very properly, I think. Because I think these low-cost private schools have got a kind of, for some good reasons, have got a bad name among many people, and that ideology thing is, which has much legitimacy to it, I actually think, but still, it's obscuring some of the interesting things which we might be able to learn from them. And we should, as proper objective scientist types, not allow that to happen. Oh, that got some reaction, or maybe a different question. The one with the Grameen phone, Grameen what? Grameen something.
I'm Fatima Zara. I'm a second year PhD student in disciplinary and consumer development. My question and thanks for coming in, it was fantastic hearing you. My question to you is, since you just briefly mentioned impact investment and public-private partnership, I would like to know, like, in what ways you think they're specifically beneficial to innovation, and are there a few examples that could detail how beneficial they are or how they have affected innovation in a meaningful way?
I think again well, first of all, I mean, we don't claim to know about everything. We're trying to document it. But so far we don't really know much about that. But again, we have interesting information from other sectors. All right, so we definitely have examples of effective impact investing from health, from agriculture. Agriculture may be easier in some ways than health or education. But so I mean, so there's some information there. In terms of public-private partnerships, I mean, I think that's why I think. I mean, if I was to pick one of these areas, and maybe it's not exactly innovative financing, but I do think that this is probably where the future might lie, because the combination of the fact that most education is both delivered and financed by the public sector, with the discipline, business practices, etc., focus on results of the private sector, that ways to orchestrate those combinations, I think, are very, very interesting. And there are many, many, many different types of public-private partnerships. Of course, I was talking about them here in terms of financing. So those are the easier things, actually, that you well, I mean, the classic cases, easy cases of provision of infrastructure. But there are interesting things going on now in Uganda. Perhaps people have heard of, I can't think now myself what they're called. But there's some schools in Uganda, a chain of schools. There is a chain which is essentially private schools which are completely following the public system. It's coming out of Britain, an organization called ARC, but I can't think what the actual name of the schools is in Uganda, I'm sorry. But we can look that up. And that is extremely interesting because they're kind of working within an agreed public-private partnership framework to provide education, to deliver education in areas where it literally was not being delivered. PEAS, that's what it's known as, PEAS. And I think it's very, very interesting. Again, I don't think we have the evidence on it, but the preliminary things look quite encouraging. And another thing which maybe another important aspect of public-private partnerships is to somehow build into the public system the accountability that goes with much private sector, activity. So, I mean, if one of the problems I think in the public sector, I mean, you may not agree, is that I was actually coming on the train with Michelle Newman to come to this lecture. At one point I mentioned that sometimes I think the only people who are held accountable for anything in education is the poor student, and usually when they fail. But I mean, to what extent teachers are really held accountable, what extent principals, what extent district education officers, I think the whole area of accountability, this is not the subject of our talk today, but I think this is an area which public-private partnerships could contribute a lot to improving the accountability. So those are not necessarily a completely coherent response, but there's certain points to what you said. And now your neighbor had a question. Yeah.
Yes, Amy Lee, thanks for your talk. Could you speak a little bit more to the process of disseminating information? So once you have an innovative idea, how do you make it known to different ministries of education?
Right. So again, I don't want to duck the question, but we're not even finished 1 year of this activity, so we sort of moved from the documenting to starting doing the analysis, and we haven't really got to that stage yet. So I think that's the stage we now are starting to want to learn more about. And again, some of these things like this partnership with UNICEF may be very helpful for that. But I don't think, so at this point it sounds like I give the same answer to every question. We have lots of indicative evidence from other sectors. We don't have much systematic evidence from, actually even systematic evidence from other sectors. And we certainly have almost none from education. So we need to develop this. But we have at least some things we can learn from other places to help us do that. So I can't really give you the answer, but maybe if you invite me back in 2 years, or your successors do, maybe I can give you the answer then. Yeah. Yeah.
I really liked your presentation because every time I thought of innovation in education, I always portrayed it in terms of input and output, but I never thought about the plus side. Thinking of innovation in finance and was really important perspective for me. My question is, most of the examples that I know of in innovation education are generally either private sector led or non-profit, etc. But do you know of any examples of government-led innovation that are sustaining to your experience?
We know of a few, and we're going to know of a lot more from this UNICEF thing, because at least half of what UNICEF claims is its 800 innovations. I'm very dubious about the number, but anyway, they've got a large number, are happening within the public system. We'll need to know much more about them, but at least we've got lists and things, and we'll need to study them a bit. But I mean, some of them probably won't be innovations, and some of them, they may not themselves realize actually it's an NGO working in a public school or something. But nonetheless, I think that we will know more about that. But we actually, now I have to reveal the realities of how you fund your operations as an institute. So we got this work going with financing from British Aid, DFID, Department for International Development, because they are interested in non-state education. So we killed it, the Center for Education Innovation, but no, please don't tell them this, but we basically said to them that what we're going to do is document non-state education. Actually, what we want to do is document innovation. But as we knew that most of it was occurring, and I'm still sure that's right, in the non-state sector, that was a way for us to get started. Now, actually, interestingly, by UNICEF coming in, they insist that we don't limit it to non-state education. So and that we've solved the problem with DFID. They don't mind so long as their money goes for non-state. So I mean, this is just how you try and structure a program when it's maybe interesting for you when you're in a kind of a non-profit institute sort of place and you depend on grants and so on. Probably same in universities.
So my question follows on these last several and on what you just said. I have written down, when you were talking about innovation, that when I talk with people wherever, they all say they're doing innovation.
Yeah.
The only people who don't say they're doing innovation are the state actors that you were referring to, because they say we're doing what we're told to do. Everybody else who is out there looking for resources, including, by the way, the state actors who may be dealing with UNICEF, are asking for money for a project that they claim is innovative or UNICEF wouldn't be funding. So I mean, I know you know this, but in a sense, it creates a bit of a tautology.
Yes.
Because what you're looking at, you know almost before you started that they think they're doing innovative work. Of course, your problem is the triage.
Exactly.
What is innovation?
Right.
And since all 800 are saying we're innovators,
well, we're clearly not going to. One, we won't be able to look at so many, and second, we're not going to accept that. That's clear.
Understood.
Even now, to get to the 400 we have documented, we've had reported to us something like 650, and of those, the ones we haven't taken, about half for a reason which is not necessarily that they're not innovative, but because they're just an idea, and we decided we're going to confine our work to things which actually exist. There may be a need someone else or even us in some other way to set up some sort of clearinghouse for interesting ideas, but that's one thing. But anyway, the other half clearly were not actually innovative, although the people who were doing them claimed they were. So I mean, we are. That said, we are erring, at least to get started. We're erring. If there's doubt, we probably would include it rather than not. Partly because we want to kind of make it a place that people want to come to. And then we will probably step up. We will step up the criteria over time. I mean, that's a tactic we've decided to follow. It has some risk attached to it, obviously, but we'll see. So anyway, so you're right.
it's a big challenge.
It's a huge challenge, yes. And we may have to use, as we go further, we may have to use. So far we're doing this largely ourselves, but we may have to use panels of experts and this sort of thing. But even that can be tricky because they may come from these conservative systems that we're talking about. So it's quite tricky. Who would be the people who are the people to tell you that an innovation is actually an innovation or not? I mean, that is a really tricky question.
So let me just follow up. So relating to your work at UNESCO, I too have worked in and around UNESCO for a long time. And I could count on multiple sets of hands the number of documents that I see out of there that say innovations in X, Y, or Z.
Right.
And what they amount to are case studies that somebody has come across.
Precisely.
How do you avoid I guess your presentation in part was how do you avoid that trap of just doing what tends to have better public relations. Some of them, ones you mentioned even, are ones that I happen to know because they do really good public relations.
Sure.
And there's plenty that don't.
Exactly. So this is a really interesting question, actually. So, I mean, of course, and especially in our first 400, are most of the ones you would think you might know about and you would expect to be there. Well, that's inevitable, exactly, because those people know how to publicize themselves and so on. But you also find, plenty that you haven't heard of. For sure you will. At the same time, there's a problem. There are many, obviously there are many more even that we don't know about. But there's a whole set that may not be at all plugged into any type of, well, literally plugged in. Maybe they're not. They don't have internet access. They might be doing some interesting things. So this is where we come now to these local partners. So part of their job is to actually find these people. These institutions that are doing things that are absolutely nowhere publicized or described or something, but which they may hear. There are ways they can try to find out about them by setting up networks and so on in their countries or regions. So that's very interesting. Our partner in India has really found a lot of things in Rajasthan, for example, just by essentially having an office in Rajasthan, and things which literally other people in Rajasthan didn't know about. So I mean, I think there is some scope here, but we need to think through how to do that more systematically. But it's the same issue arises. A completely different job we're involved in is advising a bunch of foundations that are funding innovations in secondary education. So one of the problems they've run into is that, what a surprise, more than half the innovations they fund actually are being sponsored by some type of first world organization, usually in partnership with one in a developing country. But the ideas and the impetus is coming not from the first world, and they don't particularly want that. But the problem is, if they insist on operating, we told them that the way they operate is wrong, because they insist on working through, because some of them are required to by their own rules, a request for proposals and those things. If you insist on working that way, obviously the people who don't know how to know where to find an RFP or know how to fill one out, those people won't be able to participate. So we actually trying to encourage them to stick their neck out a bit and do some direct sort of stuff, even recognizing they'll make mistakes, but some of them can't. So there are many issues around all of this, many. There's also, by the way, a belief the other way, that which may or may not be true, that there are massive number of innovations that nobody's not heard of. Maybe that's not true. I mean, that's something we need to try to find out. So one thing we also want to do is to take, again, down the road, we need to get going a bit further yet, take a couple of countries or regions or Indian states or something, and really see if we can absolutely do a completely systematic go at those areas by every method one can consider, which would be much too expensive to do normally, and just to see what really could we find there.
What's fascinating about that, I can say, is that to hear you talk about it, and I think about the classes that we teach here in Graduate School of Education. I mean, we think we're doing what you're doing.
We're not teaching anyone.
But I think we are, in some sense, ourselves ignorant of the processes by which we could do what we do.
Yes.
And so, we have access to the Global Monitoring Report. We have access to Saber.
Sure.
We have access to the internet. We have
Sure.
access to every journal.
You have students from around the world.
And we have students who are from many different places
Yeah.
in the world. It seems to me that we should be more engaged in this process, and it's interesting to me to hear that somebody working in the nonprofit sector is actually focused on this in some ways in a better way than we are, with greater attention to it. And I think that raises a challenge for us, because we think in the university we're the ones who are open to the most ideas. We want to be raising our hand. Yes, we are very interested in what you're doing, and we have the skills to evaluate it.
Yes.
But I think it's fascinating for us, and in a way it's a challenge to us, to see that there's a lot that's going on that we seem to not be able to know about. Maybe we can know about it through your website. Maybe we
Sure.
can be challenged to, and maybe there are ways of becoming involved in it. Simply
Yeah.
because it's interesting work to be done, and of course there's a great deal of scientific research that has to be behind this. because
Absolutely.
To know what an innovation is, to know what its effectiveness is, to know what its sustainability is, all these are issues that we care about here.
Yes. So our problem is we don't have core financing. We have only money for particular projects. So if we'll be happy to move our whole operation here if you give us $5 million a year of co-financing. That we can collaborate right like that. Yeah.
Well, I think maybe this is a good place to, unless there's another pressing question, I think this is a good place to stop. It is incredibly challenging what you are undertaking. We're a huge organization here at the university. We have really massive amounts of human and physical resources, and yet a relatively modest-sized operation is doing some of the kind of work that I think, we should be involved in too. So there's a little time for you to meet with some of the students afterwards if they want to come up.
Right.
Let us thank you very much for a most interesting and challenging presentation.